everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and today we are going to discuss the psychology of ideology. Namely, how does it overtake a person? What does it actually look like? Why are we resentful and bitter and mad at the system that somehow takes us over? Now, what I'm not going to look at is the boring history of how all of these ideologies and these totalitarianisms actually go from propaganda to the influence, but I want to see how it actually takes over you as an individual. But before we do, people keep asking me about a special little object that's in the background, and they want to know, well, what is it? Well, with no further ado, I want you to take a look. It is Raphael, my favorite little sort of coin collector, and he's a Ninja Turtle, as many of you know, and it's there to collect my change, obviously. But I've always liked the Ninja Turtles. I've always liked how Raphael, who was the best of the Ninja Turtles, don't you disagree with me? Don't even try disagreeing with me on this. And it's just a good reminder of just like my battle with martial arts over the years and how I've always loved it. And he's also my favorite. But most importantly, aside from all of that, it's just a great little decoration piece. So pause right there. Don't turn away. I'm going to put him back. Kind of watches over my shoulder back there a little bit. But now let's dive into this issue here. Have you ever heard stories like this? The reason I didn't get the promotion at my job is because the patriarchy, the white men, are getting the job before me. Or it's going to be something like, you know, I'm more qualified than they are, and we all know that I'm more qualified than they are, but they just keep promoting a bunch of white cisgender males. And what we find is that this is used as this argument of there's some kind of external factor, something from without that is affecting us versus other factors, maybe issues within our own lives that we could really possibly clean up, but for one reason or another, we don't. So what I want to do today is I want to continue going through our whole series on Jordan Peterson's book, Beyond Order. And we looked at how ideologies start to take over, but now I want to look at how they actually overtake us. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to deal with all of these stories about the regimes and the propaganda and all the rest. Rather, we're going to look at the psychology of it. So we're not going to look at the philosophy of it or the sociology of it or the propaganda or the politics. We're going to look at how you actually buy into this. And the reason this is important is that I think a lot of people believe, well, I'll never fall for any of this. And you get a lot of people within the church who think, well, I'm never going to fall for that. I'm too wise. I'm too cunning. I'm too biblical in my approach. And I think if we learned anything from, 2020, it's the reality that a lot of Christians can even buy into these false ideologies. So with no further ado, we are just going to switch over here. And like I said, we're going through Jordan Peterson's book, Beyond Order. Now, stick with me through this because I want you to see all the way to the end because I want to provide a solution for you. So I want to look at this from a variety of angles because the variety of angles are going to be like different ways of approaching the same issue, and maybe one will hook you. So as we go through here, one of the things that he talks about is this idea of resentment and ideology. And I thought to myself, I wonder how many people are going to understand resentment, and how he's using it here is this quote is that it's a hostile resentment. And we recognize hostile resentments. We're ticked off about usually some outside factor, something that's outside of our control, or sometimes there are real factors that are external to us that deeply affect us, and we are bitter and mad and angry at them. But notice what he talks about here. How does it actually work when it comes to ideology? He says, this hostile resentment occurs when individual failure or insufficient status is blamed both on the system within which that failure or lowly status occurs, and then, most particularly, on the people who have achieved success within that system. So you're either mad at this system, usually this nameless, faceless group that has power over you, or it's the people that are participating in it. And he goes on to say this. The former, the system, is deemed by fiat to be unjust. And we recognize this. We live in a world where, whether that system is white men or whiteness, or whether it's the patriarchy or the evil people that are taking over the environment, whatever the system may be that's in control, it's always unjust. Notice that's a presupposition they're bringing to the table. It's something that psychologically that they've already bought into. But notice this, it goes on to say this: the successful are deemed exploitative and corrupt, as they can be logically read as undeserving beneficiaries, as well as the voluntary, conscious, self-serving, and immoral supporters of the system is unjust. So notice, there's an unqualification concept, and it's always deemed this notion of being immoral and unjust, and if you're participating in it, you're going along to get along. Now, here's where this grabs us, and I think this is why this is important, is that the reason it grabs us and the reason that it becomes such a particular thing is for the simple fact that for many of us, we realize we've been burned a time or two, and that there are sometimes people that are in hiring positions or in firing positions or in HR departments that have truly done things that are immoral. But notice what it's going on to say here. As he's dealing with this is just this notion of how he's dealing with the notion of ideology in particular. And it's this notion of this nameless, faceless thing. It's not dealing with necessarily real people, but then when he's dealing with real people, they're always buying into the quote system. So starting off, I want us to have this idea of we're ticked off because of either the system or the people that bought into the system. So stay with me here. Notice this. We have this idea of social identities and systems of oppression. So look at the picture that we have here, this concept of how social identity might affect us. And it can be things from race, age, sexual orientation, immigration status, gender, ability, religion, or class. Now, some of these might be shared social constructs. And it's funny because I'm getting these straight from all these leftist woke groups that want us to break ourselves down into all these different groups. And the reason they do this is they want us to be psychologically affected by them. They want to have these almost false causal factors, these lens that are the justified means of these immoral people and why we should be mad at them and resentful at them. So we've already looked at this whole issue of how it may be with gender and race, or we see things about age. Well, the reason they did this to me is because the system's against old people. Or you would see things like religion that came about, and people are always talking about how there's Islamophobia within our world today, and how, the reason that they're not able to gain any status in this world is because we're against the Muslim or we're against whomever. In addition to it, we might talk about things like immigration status. The reason that these people in Iowa don't like these individuals coming up from Mexico, what I'm talking about, is because they're a bunch of ignorant, naive farmers that just own all the land. And because of that, yada, yada, yada. We hear how all of these things come about. But the point is that there's something related to this external ideology, whether it's going to be any of the ones we've discussed, but most important, how that ideology intersects with your social identity. So let's keep going here. Let's continue looking at this. So you see something here with the National Equity Project, leftists, of course, and they draw these two circles. You got the individual and you've got the systemic. And a systemic concept is this feature or property that's inherent within institutions or structures. So it could be things like policies and practices at the organization and levels that perpetuate oppression, or structural, how these affects and interact across different institutions. And you as the individual have to interact with this. So that this notion of how they intersect with the interpersonal and the interactions between people both within and across the differences. And what they're trying to say here is that the reason you as the individual in your interpersonal relationships, the psychology of it, are struggling, it's not because necessarily of you, but it's always the system. So how do you fix it? Well, if you go along with it, you're buying into it. So if a person's wealthy or they're getting promoted or they're having, some good thing happen to them, well, they're clearly participating, and usually it's whiteness and patriarchy and maleness and all these. So what's the simple answer that they try to give? We know what they usually try to give. We need to undo the system, man. We got to get rid of the system, man. The system's what's holding us down. So if we got rid of the system, we'd be able to fix our problems. But notice some of the things that we look at with this is that these are basic features that are within what they're going to say cooked into society. So it could be something within the Constitution. It could be something within our laws. It could be something within our banking industry. And ultimately, when you look at how these things are in praxis, how they actually work out, because it's both theory and praxis, is that you got to buy into the theory, which was step one, buying into the ideology. How do they? But then it's the praxis of it, the undoing, the unmasking of it. And this is why we're in the society that we're in today, is that we've spent literally just decades upon decades, probably close to a century, maybe even a century and a half, dealing with this, what I would call a Marxist indoctrination. And we know what that Marxist indoctrination has been doing. It's been creating revolutionaries within all of our different schools. And that's where you get the story of, why did I not get this? Something in the system. Why did I not get that promotion? Something within the system. Why did I get pulled over? Something within the system. So now that brings us to this next portion of, why do people get resentful? Well, it's because they're fighting the system. They feel like they've been unjustly hurt. And what it does is it gives us these causal thought chains. You know, A is the cause of B, and maybe it prevents C. Or it could be something like this prevention. Sanding causes dust and the prevention of adhesions. But when it works in a social sense, it's, you know, the system causes oppression, which is why I'm poor. The system causes low wages, which is why I'm poor. Or the system is why we have CO2 emissions, which is why we have global warming. And the answer to it is global Marxism, or give up your car, or give up whatever it is. And that's why whenever we talk about this, we always recognize that the evil man is the racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobe who's holding us down. And I want to challenge this concept. So in the next section here, one of the things that Jordan Peterson does is he talks about resentment and causal thought chains. So the issues are this: we live in a world plagued by significant resent, where people feel shunned, exploited, or kept down by something external to them. And that's the key. It's always something external, and it's always oppressive, and we get angry by it. Now, the causal thought chains would be this. This occurs when a person entertains a thought that some outside factor is the reason or grounds of one's condition. So the effect is a person feels morally justified at attempting to lash out and seek revenge, or justified resentment towards the system. So here's how Peterson says this: once this causal chain of thought has been accepted, all attacks on the successful can be construed as morally justified attempts at establishing justice, rather than, say, manifestations of envy and covetousness that might have traditionally been defined as shameful. So notice what he's trying to say here is that once you have this system that is the causal thought chain explanation, it's a lot to say there, you can then fight this unjust system. Now, notice what he's starting to look at, and this is going to build into where we're going with this. There are times where we do recognize something could be affected this. You got a buddy who got the job because, you know, the dad is a friend of whatever, and we recognize that. But notice what he says sometimes. Traditionally, we would actually fight the bigger issue, the bigger vice. Namely, is it the system, or is it you? Is it your heart? Is it the envy that you have? And this is why when you look at some of these issues of virtue ethics and training of one's heart on these matters, we realize this. And I think Plato and Aristotle and many of the Stoics recognize something like this, that what's the greater harm that's done to a person? So let me tell you a story about this. If you have a person who's walking down the street and they're going along and some person approaches them and asks for their wallet and you refuse to give it to them. So then they're going along and the person demands that they give them the money, and the person refuses again. So the burglar comes up and pulls out a gun and shoots the person, killing the individual. And obviously that individual is going to go to jail, or if he gets caught or whatever. But here's where these philosophies could help us to understand them. You know, who was actually injured more? Was it the person who had harm done just to their body, or was it the person that has vice within their soul, namely the person who actually killed the individual? And historically, it's been argued that within this traditional system, The person who suffered the greater harm is not the one whose body who's been injured. It's he who bears the vice. And that's why Peterson's evaluation here is so important, is that what they're trying to say here is that this could be a manifestation of envy and covetousness. Maybe you think that you're morally virtuous and you're calling out this system because you bought in this false causal thought chain, when really what we have to find is it an issue of envy as manifested as a vice in your life? Now, let's continue looking here. He talks about the victims of ideological pursuit. He says there's another typical feature of ideological pursuit. The victims supported by ideologues are always innocent. And it is sometimes true that victims are innocent, or sometimes it is the truth that they are innocent, and that perpetrators are always evil, and evil perpetrators are also not in short supply. So notice what he's trying to say here is that when you buy into this psychology of it, you are always innocent. And the person who did it to you is always manifestly evil. So the boss that does something is always the person that's in wrong, or the person that gets the promotion is always in the air there. Whereas he's noticing that we sort of turn ourselves into little saints. We always think we're innocent, holy, and just. But notice this, he says, but the fact that there exists genuine victims and perpetrators provides no excuse to make low resolution, blanket statements about the global scale of blameless victimization and evil perpetration, particularly of the type that does not take the presumed innocence of the accused firmly into account. So let's break this down here a little bit. He's noticing that there are real times and real instances of a perpetrator. We're not denying this, but we can't take this to make these blanket statements that whenever you're in a difficult situation or somebody's in a difficult situation, notice that what he says here, and he calls them low resolution blanket statements about the global scale of blameless victimization and evil perpetration. And he goes on to say this, where the driving factor, and stick with me on this, is this notion that they're always innocent and that there's never anything wrong with them that's going on. So continue to look here with this. One of the things that we find here very clearly is that the presupposition of you always being innocent might be one of the ground issues that you're suffering from. It might be the reason, might be the true thought causal chain. Like I said, that's a lot to say here. And what we have to do is we need to continue going and looking that we can't make blank statements. So let me tell you another story here. I want to continue illustrating this. There's something that I call the 102 person rule, or 102 person argument. You got 50 people in one room and 50 people in another. And let's just make it out as though 50 are white and 50 are black. And within this, what you're going to find is that you're going to see the way that the story can be perpetrated is that all the people who are in each room, they're going to say, have a sociology of knowledge. We're all going to think the exact same way. But the issue is that what they're doing is that in their sociology of knowledge, they're giving almost personhood to the collective group. So within the black person room, you've got the sociology of knowledge of one, and within the white person room, you've got the sociology knowledge of another one, hence the two extra people. But the problem with that is that from like a philosophical, metaphysical notion, there's actually not 102 people in there, because groups aren't individuals. Groups don't have true think. Now, do groups of people sometimes all think the same way? Yes. But what we find is that within these segments and within these sort of, group analyses that they're giving, there's radical divergence of thought within each one. Do all white people think the same way? No. Do all black people think the same way? No. So that individual controlling person really is false. In addition to it, when they always talk about being dominated by the controlling thought patterns, notice this: who has the most dominance within their paradigm? It's always the 101st and 102nd person that not only tells you what to think, but demands that you think that way. And that's why we talk about this here is that why are you innocent? Because usually some dominating external group, nameless, faceless person, not a real thing that can force thought upon you, is victimizing you. And because of that, you're innocent. But those are blanket false statements. So let's continue looking here. How does group guilt and ideology work? Now, notice this. He says no group guilt should be assumed, and certainly not of the multi-generational kind. It is a certain sign of the accuser's evil intent and a harbinger of social catastrophe. But the advantage is that the ideologue, at little practical cost, can construe him or herself both as nemesis of the oppressor and defender of the oppressed. Who needs the fine distinctions that determination of individual guilt or innocence demands when a prize as such beckons? So notice this. When you have this notion of group guilt, it's really just an evil, manipulative ploy used by ideologues in order to construct the whole situation. And it's a harbinger, as he says, this social catastrophe. And notice what he starts to say here. He says, like we said here, what's the advantage of this? Like, there's really no practical cost to them. It's an easy blanket statement to say. And you can be both the nemesis of the oppressor and the defender of the oppressed. So, like we've said, praxis and theory, or theory and praxis, they lock literally hand to hand here. So when a person buys into the ideology, the psychology of it has grasped them, and they're truly innocent, they can make these blanket statements, and they do it all the time. You know, the reason you did this is because you're a racist, or the reason you did this is because you're part of the patriarchy. It costs them absolutely nothing to do so. But now they can look morally virtuous. They can fight you or fight the ideology, and they can defend the victims. Doesn't this sound like the world that we live in today? Doesn't this sound so much of like what we're facing right now? So how do we continue looking at this? I want to build this. Please stick with me here. So notice this. This is the concept of fighting the enemy without. And let's illustrate it in three different ways. Wealth. Peterson says, if wealth is the problem to issue, for example, and the wealthy perceived as the reason for poverty and all the other problems of the world, then the wealthy become the enemy, indistinguishable in some profound sense from a degree of evil, positively demonic in its psychological and social significance. So wealth is the problem, and it's always the wealthy. So how do you fix the system? You go after the wealthy. This is AOC. This is the Social Democrats. This is all the rest. Or what if it's power? He says if power is the problem, then those who have established any authority at all are the singular cause of the world's suffering. So we hear the narrative. It's because they have power and we're powerless. So if anybody, whether it's a parent over you, or whether it's a boss over you, or a police officer, any form manifestation of power, then they're the problem of your situation. The reason I flunked the test is because the teacher in power is over me. The reason that I got pulled over is because the person in power over me. Or what if it's masculinity? If masculinity is the problem, then all males, or even the concept of male, notice that, must be attacked and vilified. Notice how he makes this interesting transition here. It's not just, oops, hit the wrong button here. Notice this. It's not just the concept or individual males. It's the actual concept of maleness, or the concept of whiteness that may get it. So again, going back to the original illustration, systemic concepts, how do they work? Systemic ideas that are cooked into systems. It's not just you as an individual who are perpetuating maleness and whiteness. It could be you just bearing the essence of a male are perpetuating it here. So let's continue looking at what this might look like. He says what this does is we're always fighting the enemy without. He says such division of the world into the devil without and the saint within justifies self-righteous hatred necessitated by the morality of the ideological system itself. This is a terrible trap. Notice this. Listen to what he says here. Once the source of evil has been identified, it becomes the duty of the right to eradicate it. This is an invitation to both paranoia and persecution. A world where only you and the people who think like you are good is also a world where you are surrounded by enemies bent on your destruction who must be fought. And this is why he's talking about this. Notice this. This is why he's specifically talking about this. Why are people paranoid and always feel persecuted? Because they always feel like the enemy without is everywhere around them, that they're constantly fighting it. They surround themselves with people of it. So the psychology of it is you buy into these ideological systems. You're always innocent because the system's always the perpetuator of it. You surround yourself with a group of people like this and you go nuts. You are paranoid. I mean, it's like the idea that there's a demon behind me, or there's a demon behind every single rock, or you get these people that get crazy and it's like, oh, they got a tick on their body and they're like, oh, where is it? I feel it. And they pull it off and you check, but they're still convinced that it's around there. Well, what if it's not just like bugs or a demon, but literally everything, the law, the society, the school, all of it. And that's why they feel like they're constant victims all the time. This is the psychology of it. That's why you're constantly fighting. They never stop. So what's the solution? What's his solution to this? I think it's a great solution. We recognize what they're going on. The first one is don't buy into false ideologies. Just stop buying into the vain Marxist totalitarian ideologies. But psychologically, what should we do? You control the things that you can actually control. If the patriarchy or whiteness or whatever it is really keeping you down, man, and you really believe there's nothing you can do about it shy of a Marxist revolution, okay, well, how about you just stop thinking like that and fight things that you really can? And notice what he says. It is much safer morally to look to yourself for the errors of the world, at least to the degree to which someone honest and free of willful blindfulness might consider. You are likely to be much more clear-minded about what is what and who is, or what is what and who is who, and where blame lies once you contemplate the log in your own eye, rather than the speck in your brother's eye. It is probable that your own imperfections are evident and plentiful and could profitably be addressed as step one in your Redeemer's quest to improve the world. So what's the initial answer to this? Fix your own problems before you go out trying to fix the whole other world's problems. And this is so much of what we see, is that whether it be from Marxists or from feminists or environmentalists or, the whole Christian nationalist movement that's going on and all these other isms and schisms, is that they're so hell-bent on fixing everything without. And I really just want to ask them the question, what in the world are you doing to fix yourself? Or as Jordan Peterson says, how about you clean up your own room before you go out and try to clean up the whole world? And there's so much truth to this, is that it's so easy for us to do this. And I'll confess, like, people might be thinking, oh, you're trying to fix us right now. No, I'm fixing myself by just talking about this. This is a way of me thinking through this and trying to help my home and my community and people that are on this channel, because I think this is a true problem that we face, because we're constantly hearkening and bickering and whining about all these things that go on. But how many times do we work on self-improvement? How many times do we work on trying to better our lives? And, I can share stories from myself on this. I realize that there are times where my Bible reading's terrible, so I have to focus on it, or doing family devotions with my wife, so I have to focus on it. Going to the gym and lifting weights and trying to build more strength, going to striking, work on this so I'm better, or grappling and all the rest. When it could be, the reason I didn't get this or that. No, I can focus on the things that I need to focus on. So continue here. We're almost done. Just bear with me here. Please stick with me to the end. So people have this Redeemer's quest to improve the world. Notice what he says here. This is the notion to take the world's sins onto yourself, to assume responsibility for the fact that things have not been set right in your own life and elsewhere is part of the messianic path. Part of the imitation of the hero is the most profound senses. This is a psychological or spiritual rather than sociological or political issue. So notice what he's trying to say here. Instead of working on just the politics and the sociology of it, if you want to really be like this Redeemer messianic figure, you need to actually be able to save that which you're trying to redeem. And if you can't actually save something, well, then you're just blowing hot air. That's why, again, focus on yourself, focus on your family, focus on your community. Now, some people are going to say, well, this is just that naive, pietistical. Well, guess what? It's not just naive and it's not just pietistical. It's not either or. It's just putting things in right order. Is that if you have a big jar and you want to fill it with, say, rocks and sand and other random objects, you don't pour all the sand in there and then try to put the rocks in there and put your little jewels and toys in there. Rather, what you do is you put the rocks in there and then you put the little jewels in there and then you pour the sand in there. Why? Because you got to get the big things in order first. And the big things are not the enemies from without. The real big things are the enemies from within, namely those things that are directly reflecting the vices and the virtues that are plaguing your soul. So fix yourself before you always go out trying to fix everything else. I think that would solve a lot of the world's problems here. So let's keep looking here. This notion of fighting ideology says it is impossible to fight patriarchy, reduce oppression, promote equality, transform capitalism, save the environment, eliminate competitiveness, reduce government, or to run every organization like a business. Such concepts are simply too resolute. The Monty Python comedy crew once offered satirical lessons for playing the flute. Blow over one end and move your fingers up and down on the holes. True, but useless. The necessary detail is simply not there. So continuing on, he says, similarly, sophisticated large-scale processes and systems do not exist in a manner sufficiently real to render their comprehensive unitary transformation possible. The idea that they do is the product or the produce of 20th century cults. The belief of these cults are simultaneously naive and narcissistic, and the activism they promote is the resentful, lazy person substitute for actual accomplishment. The single axioms of the ideologically possessed are gods, served blindly by their proselytizers. So notice what he's trying to say here. This idea of these large-scale systems that you're going to transform. And he says that they're almost cultic in this sense. And the beliefs in these things are both naive and narcissistic. And the activism that they promote actually is a substitute for any true accomplishment. What it actually does is it makes you a bitter, angry, resentful person who's never cleaned up their own life, who's never done anything with their own life outside of complain about the systems. And in that sense, they're serving their gods, their false gods. And that idol is going to make you hard of heart, bitter, resentful, angry. And sadly, they're the largest proselytizing cults in the world today. These race Marxists, patriarchal Marxists, environmental Marxists are all just proselytizing cults that make people angry, bitter, unjust, and so forth. So let's finish here. What should we do? How should we solve this? Should we throw our arms up in the air? No. Rather, clean up our own houses, clean up our own lives, disciple people, mentor people, serve in your church, serve in your classrooms, find somebody that you can make a difference in their life. That's how we fix a lot of these. So coming back to this, the psychology of resentment. Instead of fighting the nameless, faceless, sort of distant, separated, yet always present, ubiquitous God of the system, how about we bend our knee to the true God of the universe and realize that that God, the God of the Bible, trumps all false gods, and that God calls us to clean up our own lives. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Maybe instead of reading things like Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and realizing how you can be a social justice warrior, how about you read the, Sermon on the Mount and realize how something like that will not only change you, but by changing you, it changes your heart of the matter and the people in your circle of influence. So again, thank you. My name is Dr. Bill Roach. Please like, subscribe, and share this video.
Oh, it was a fraternity prank. Also, the Pope decided today to release Vatican-related bath products. An incredible thing. Yes, it's a new Pope on a rope. It's right, Pope on a rope. Wash with it, go straight to heaven. Thank you.
Samsonite. I was way off.